everybody, it's Lisa Marie here. Hi, my sweet lifers. Welcome to another Sweet Scoop. For those of you that are watching on the channel, welcome. And for those of you that are listening on the podcast, welcome as well. And happy Mother's Day to you guys. Mother's Day is coming up this weekend, and it's always an exciting time for me. I photograph so many mommies, and there's so many things going on around Mother's Day. And Mother's Day, of course, is a really special day for those of us who are mothers, and even for those of us that aren't mothers as well. I'm sure I've got lots of friends in my life that have chosen to not have children. They have fur babies, and they still celebrate and enjoy this day, this weekend, just as much as those of us that have made babies have, do as well. So I'm looking forward to spending some time with the kids and with the family and all of that stuff. So it's just going to be a very exciting time. Although we do have a lot of rain scheduled in Texas, and we've had a lot of rain today as well. So the Sweet Life Garden is going strong, I promise you. By the time I go out there and do another garden tour here in another week or so, I bet you there'll be melons, and I know there's more artichokes and all kinds of stuff. Today I want to talk about where I'm at with seminary again, as I always do, and kind of give you a little fill-in of where we were maybe last week, and then kind of roll forward where I am now in my work with seminary. Still working on Joshua. And in Joshua, there's a couple of things that I have sort of gleaned. The Holy Spirit has revealed to me that I wanted to share with you, something for you to think about. If you guys will recall, back in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch section of the Old Testament, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Moses is with God. And when he goes to the mountain and he is speaking with the Lord, he is asked to remove his sandals because he's walking on holy ground. And something interesting happens in Joshua that's very similar to this. And Joshua is Moses's successor to lead the Israelites into the promised land. And Joshua is actually approached when he is getting ready to go into battle and start working on building territories that God has ordained for him to have and to bring the Israelites into, with this figure, this commander of the armies. And he has a sword drawn, and Joshua asks him, he says, are you for us or against us? And he says that he's the commander of the Lord's armies. And so I've been doing some research to see who that is, because I think that it may be, and I've actually read somewhere this last week, that it's the Son of Man. So if that's the case, I've been doing a lot of back and forth with you guys on what comes up in my mind as I'm going through all these different books of the Bible. If that's the case, and that other guy that I never can say his name, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, who also appears, who has no history, no genealogy, if he's not Jesus, Primera Jesus, actually becoming a man on earth, I'm kind of feeling like this commander of the armies is. And it really makes sense, because when you start looking at the relationship between Joshua and Revelation, you start to glean a real sense of the history that God is revealing to us in the scriptures through Joshua is a foretaste in all the battles being won and overtaking the promised land and getting these Israelites to where they need to be to then spread throughout the land and other nations, coming from his promise that he made to Abraham, that his word, his people will be to will spread to all nations, is extremely parallel to Christ coming back and coming in as an army, and as a warrior king, and coming in and conquering Satan and the evil that is still lingering here in the old earth. So there's some parallels there that I really want you to take a look at, because I was really, when I saw that, read that, I actually went and researched it to sort of catch and see if I could find out any other scholars that may have done some research to try to interpret what exactly who that commander is. And somewhere I've read it's the Son of Man. So the Son of Man is Jesus. That is what, in all of my so far studies, one of the titles that Jesus has been given. And so that's something for us to look at and maybe do a little bit more research on. Another thing I want to talk to you about is this miracle of supernatural power that runs throughout Joshua. It runs throughout Joshua in so many ways, but in the very beginning, of Joshua where he's talking about, or there's scriptures that talk about Jericho, which I mentioned last week, and also in the conquering of Ai, you have got a serious supernatural thing going on with God, where he basically just takes over and tells Joshua what to do in terms of marching around the city. And every bit of that is in faith to God, that God will do as promised, because they're not coming in with like massive armies. They're not coming in with swords drawn. They're just walking around the city. And on that seventh day, when the trumpets are tooted by the priests and the people shout and all the walls fall down, that is a huge miraculous thing that has happened and taken place. Similarly, it happens in Ai. Obviously, you guys that have studied know that one of these guys that was in the army, the Israel army, takes back what he's not supposed to take back, and he basically steals not only what's not belonging to him, but also what was belonging to God. And God becomes outraged by this because the spoils of the plunder of Jericho, all of them, every single piece of iron, silver, gold, sapphires, anything that's found while they're in that plundering of the city of Jericho is supposed to be given directly to the Lord. And this guy shows up and he doesn't do that. His name is Akatan, maybe Akan or Achan. Anyway, I'll put that in the notes if I can remember to do that. You can look it up. It's in Joshua. I've always had a horrible time trying to pronounce these names of some of these people in the Bible. But anyway, and it's not until he repents and the whole world of Israel, their whole union, all the people of Israel repent, that God then comes back to them and helps them to conquer the next area that they're supposed to conquer as they're going into the promised land. So it's something to be said about that too, is that when you give all of your faith in God and you relinquish your own power, it's allowing himself, or you're allowing him to, or you're not allowing him because he's going to do what he wants to do anyway because he's God, obviously, but he will give you successes, and he will show you through his supernatural behavior and ability to actually give you the successes that you didn't really earn, because these guys didn't. These lands that they have been given are lands that they've been given. They did not. They literally fell into it because God's hand was on it, and that's what he wanted. That's what he promised Abraham way back in Genesis. And so now all these years have happened, and these Israelites have suffered, and these Israelites have turned away from God, and then they've turned to God. And it's when they turn to God is whenever he actually reveals himself in all of his glory and grace to them and gives them the blessings of the next steps forward to becoming a great nation. So it's an interesting thing to think about in our own lives too, because I know that I feel like sometimes there's been projects that I've worked on and I feel like I'm just butting my head up against a brick wall. Nothing is going to happen. It just doesn't happen the way I think it's supposed to happen. And it doesn't happen the way that I thought it would happen. And I know you guys have had that happen as well. And then I'll just either walk away and say, this is just not meant to be, and acknowledge that. Or I'll say, okay, Lord, this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to worry about this anymore. I'm just going to give all of this over to you to figure out. It's beyond me what to do next, and let you just take care of it. And then oddly enough, not oddly enough as a shock, but like, hello, duh, for those of us that are Christians and believe, it just works itself out. There's another way that's made a way to make it happen, or it just fizzles and it wasn't meant to be anyway. So it's an interesting way of looking at life, and it's really how I've been for the last several months in seminary, is that, each day, instead of me getting up and making this long list of things to do, which I used to do and did for years, I just get up and pray and say, okay, let this day unfold however it needs to, and let me touch whoever's life I need to touch. And you never know what's going to happen. And it's amazing when you look back on the day, if you do that, how you've been guided through the day. The things that needed to get done got done. The things that didn't need to get done can still be done tomorrow. And God has sort of been able to work his way through it and really weave into the day a way for you to touch other people's lives or make a difference or get further ahead in the goals and things that he would like for you to be doing. And so it's an interesting way of looking at actually just living, honestly. Another book that we've been working on this week has been the book of Ruth. And I have to tell you, I just love Ruth. I mean, I've really fallen in love with Ruth because Ruth is honestly the greatest love story aside from the whole Bible. Because I've told you guys many weeks ago, the Bible is a love story. It's God's love story to humanity. But this book of Ruth is so special because it shows what happens whenever you give your heart all to the Lord. And here you have this woman who, Naomi, her mother in law, who's lost her husband. She's lost both of her sons. She's got these two daughter in laws. One of them, well, both of them, she tries to send back to their family. And there's not supposed to be this intermarriage stuff going on. You know, it was not a normal thing for different tribes to marry into each other. A lot of that was seen as not cool at all. I know that our society today is so interdispersed that it's maybe a foreign concept for you to think about. But these girls had married her sons, and these sons had died. And so here's this woman, Naomi, a widow and no longer able to be the mother to her two sons. And not only that, neither one of these daughters in law made any babies. So there's no heirs. So there's just absolutely a real sad time for them. And so Naomi decides that she's going back to her homeland. And Naomi decides she's going back to her homeland and wants to push Ruth and her other sister, her other daughter-in-law off to back to their tribes. And Ruth says no. Ruth says absolutely not. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to stay with you. I loved your son and I want to be with you and take care of you. And back in those days, you guys know, or maybe you don't know, so here you go. Women were very dependent on men, and women were not taken care of if their husbands died. So a lot of these widows would go into poverty. They didn't have a place to stay. They didn't have any land that they had, to work or be able to make a living. And so it was a really sad time for Naomi and even for Ruth, actually, because she was widowed as well and childless. And so these two women walk into this city and they're walking in dirt poor, basically with the shirts on their backs. And there's no plan. It's like, what are we going to do? And Ruth is basically given all of her faith to the one true God. She's come back. She didn't go back to her tribe, who was worshiping a different God. She went to Naomi's hometown where they were Israelites. And, these guys are worshiping God, right? And so Ruth puts her faith and trust in God. And as luck, as you say, in secular world, but not in Christian world, as God would have it, because we don't believe in luck, as God would have it, she is exactly at the place and time that she's supposed to be in to meet Boaz. And Boaz is a distant relative of Naomi's, and he's actually the one that's second in line to take care of them. Because in that whole cultural society, you've got men who were in line to take care of those women who had been widowed. And more importantly, if you're, like, let's say if your brother died, you as a son-in-law were supposed to also marry that widow and make a baby with her, with the seed of the family, to have an heir for your brother who died, for his family. So there's a lot of responsibility in making heirs and making sure that the familial lineage goes on past that particular death of that one son. And so it was a very big responsibility. And Boaz is out here in the field. He's got all this harvest and grain, and they're there during the season to harvest. And Ruth goes out into his field, not any field, but his field, because God had ordained that for her. And she meets Boaz, and Boaz protects her. He actually knows she's pretty, and she has a chance that she may be raped. And so he tells her to stay close to the women that are in there in the fields working for him so that they can protect her. And she collects the harvest, and she's able to take some of it back to her space that she's living in with Naomi, so they have food to eat, and then they have clothes to wear. And Boaz really works to be a very much and I want to say an angelic figure. I mean, he is really a remarkable man. He's a human man, obviously, but he was just so good to her. And then Naomi starts to get some ideas, right? Because mother-in-laws tend to do that anyway. But she's getting ideas about what the next steps are for Ruth. And when she finds out that Ruth's over there in her distant familial relatives' field, she asks Ruth to go over there after the harvest has come in and they're threshing it on the floor. And when he's tired and asleep, to sit down at Boaz's feet and uncover his feet, basically so he's going to wake up in the middle of the night and find Ruth there, which under all other normal circumstances, men would have found as an open invitation for you know what. But Boaz didn't do that. Boaz saw what was going on, and he realized that he had an opportunity for a responsibility, not only for his family, but also he had respect for Ruth, not to take advantage of her. And she basically told him that she wanted to be married to him. She wanted to make herself available to him as his wife. And he had to let her know that there was somebody in line above him. And they call it a redeemer in the Bible. And when I first read it, I actually texted my priest because I was like, what does this redeemer mean? Like, what does that word mean in Hebrew? Because I'm trying to figure out a lot of the words that we have translated from different generations, different translations. What would that word have meant? And it's basically the person who is next in line to help take over when someone has been widowed. It's the person who is the responsible male party to make sure that these women were cared for. And so there's this guy over here in the lineage of who's lined up to do it. And Boaz tells Ruth, just go to sleep and stay right here with me. And in the morning, I'm going to take care of this and figure out what to do. And he also thanks her for not selecting some young man, because he's not a young guy. I mean, he's not some guy that's just, all buff and that in a bag of chips waiting to get a new wife. He's an older man. He's had children. He's had wives. He's a man who is of a good heart and with the Lord a good spirit, and he has a lot of grace to have welcomed Ruth into the Israelite people, knowing that she was not from that tribe. And so he has showed her grace and kindness all along the way by protecting her with the young maidens, making sure that she wasn't left alone in the fields and in danger. He's provided her with food. He's provided her with clothes. He's provided her with a job. And so he sends her back to Naomi so that she doesn't go to her, and it's in the Bible, empty-handed. And Naomi, of course, has plotted this whole thing, thinking that it's going to turn into I don't know what. She seems like a very interesting woman in terms of conniving, honestly. I don't know what her thoughts were by sending Ruth there in the middle of the night. Well, I know what her thoughts were, but it's interesting that that's not how God played that together to make it happen. But what happens is in the morning, so Boaz goes out to the gate, and he basically gives notice that Naomi's got some land that her husband owned, and that somebody in the family, the first person in line, needs to buy it so that they've got a place to live and food to eat and all of that. And the guy says, I'm not interested in marrying Ruth, and I'm not interested in taking care of Naomi. And so because of that, not wanting that responsibility, and also of making a baby with Ruth so that her lineage goes on for Naomi and that family, not interested in that, Boaz steps in and says, I'm second in line, so I'm going to do this. And so what's beautiful is there's this wedding feast, there's this wonderful marriage between Ruth and Boaz, and out of that union they have a son, and that son is the father of David, And so Ruth is the great grandmother of King David, which is basically the greatest king that Israel has ever known. And oddly enough, she becomes, because of that, by default, she's automatically then a ancestress for the Son of God, Jesus Christ, because Jesus came from the line of David. And so it's a really beautiful story about redemption. It's a story about being gracious, of welcoming someone from afar into your home, into your tribe, into your world that's not like you, loving them with open arms and providing and caring for them, which is what we do for fellow Christians. There's a lot of lessons to be learned. And the most important lesson is that God worked out all of that bad stuff. Like Ruth was widowed, Ruth was poor, Ruth was, in a foreign land. Ruth was just not in a good place. And in the end, she was wealthy. She owned land. She became the great grandmother of David. She's the ancestor to and the responsible party for creating the line for Jesus Christ. And so her role became huge. And in the Bible, there's only two books that are named after women. There's Esther and there's Ruth. And Ruth, I mean, honestly, this is a beautiful story. And it's not a long chapter. It's an easy chapter to read. You could probably read it in less than 30 minutes. So I encourage you guys to do that this week. That's one of my little assignments for you guys this week. Read Ruth. I don't know about Joshua. Joshua, I'm still unpacking. It's going to be a minute before I have all of my head wrapped around Joshua, because Joshua's got a lot going on. We've got all kinds of stuff going on there. But I will say that it is still every single day an absolute joy to be studying and doing seminary. I'm starting to look at doctoral programs now, and I am really very enthusiastic about going ahead and pursuing that doctorate, because there's not ever too much time spent on the Word of Lord, and there's not ever too much time spent understanding all that's there to teach us. I mean, there's in almost every single book so many nuggets that you can glean on how to live your life and how to be a better person, and how to lean on God and have faith in Him for everything and all things. And of course, His Son Jesus Christ. I mean, that is the ultimate, honestly. So for those of you guys that have not done that, if you do want to spend some time thinking about all of the things that are in the Bible, and then come back to the situation where we've got the Son that was born, and understand that it's through Him that we get to heaven. And I'm reading a really great book about heaven, which I may start talking about next week. And it's got all kinds of cool information about heaven. I got into heaven, reading about heaven rather, and angels, and working on all of that stuff as I was working in Revelation. And that has opened up a whole new line of, I mean, I've got literally each week I've got like the work I'm doing for seminary, and then I've got a whole side shoot of stuff that's happening as I find this out in the Bible. It takes me down this path to go study this part of this to figure out more about that, so I can understand more about the Bible. So it's just an overflowing of information and absorbing all the wonderful goodness that's in this Bible, and the words that the Lord has given us and inspired others to write, so that we can understand a lot about Him and what He's doing in our lives and has done throughout the history of humanity. So anyway, I hope that you guys have enjoyed this. I hope that you guys will keep tuning in. I am so thrilled to share with you kind of where I'm at each week. And like I said before, I hope you guys have a happy Mother's Day. I'll keep plugging along, and I'll get back with you next Tuesday, and we'll see you soon. Stay sweet. Take care.